This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers brought to you by the Fur Bearers. We're talking old-growth logging this week. But Mike, we all know old-growth logging is bad. Why spend time on it? Well, Mike, simply put, because we don't all know old-growth logging is bad, as per the ongoing old-growth logging. The subject has been in the news a great deal lately, particularly with the most recent blockade and standoffs at Fairy Creek on Vancouver Island. In reading the ongoing coverage of this subject, I recognized that the media wasn't spending as much time on the background. Why are old-growth trees different or more valuable than others? Why is it so important for endangered species that these trees be protected? And if they're so important, why isn't species at risk legislation protecting them? I connected with Charlotte Dawe of the Wilderness Committee in BC to dig into the basics of old-growth forests and logging, to answer these questions and others, and show off some of the tools currently available to folks who want to have their voices heard. Let's get started. I guess the important place to start is what an old-growth forest is. I mean, is this just a forest with big trees? Is this a specific type of tree? Or is this a specific region in BC and elsewhere? What is an old-growth forest?
So old-growth forests are actually defined differently depending on who you talk to. There's a couple ways you can think about what an old-growth forest is. One is obviously old trees. Old trees don't necessarily mean big trees. You could have old trees that are in a swamp that are, in their, 900-year-old range, and they're going to be small because they're waterlogged and they're not growing very big. Or in like high alpine sites where the growing season is very short, they might be very old, but they might not look very big. But that's still an old growth forest, right? And then you have like the high productive, oldest, biggest trees. That's what a lot of people think about when you think about BC's old growth forest. It's those massive cedars, spruces, meters wide, highly productive, spaced out canopy, because through time they've spaced themselves out, so you have like one big tree every half kilometer. That's kind of the forest that I like to think about as the old growth forests that we're talking about in BC that are at risk. And of the old growth forests in BC that are at risk, of the oldest and the biggest, we have less than 1% left. So if you think about old growth forests, which is like generally over 600 years old, of the oldest and the biggest, we have 1% left. Less than 1% left. Yeah.
And they're highly desirable, as you said, because of their production value. So in one tree, you get more product. Is effectively the solution.
Exactly.
Or the
wood you get is extremely sought after by different logging companies for different products. Like, for instance, cedar from old growth forests in BC goes to shingles. They make great shingles for rich people in Florida. So
very specific.
So we are cutting down our old growth trees for rooftop shingles.
So when you hear, and this is just my observation, is when I hear about this, I'm normally thinking, well, we need these to build homes and infrastructure, and our society will falter without this. And that's not really the case, is what I'm hearing. It's not, these are the trees we need. It's just, those are the trees they want.
Totally. And to expand on that, on the island, most of the Vancouver Island logging is destined for raw log exports. So in the interior, it's a little bit of a different story. We have more mills, but a bunch of mills closed down decades ago. And since that, it becomes more profitable for logging corporations to ship their raw logs overseas. So we're not even processing them here. So obviously we're not using them in our homes here if we're just shipping them as logs overseas. So so that's kind of where we're at. And we still import a bunch of wood also from places like Asia and stuff to build our homes. So it's it's a very confusing production supply chain.
Yes, yeah, and that's what I think is odd. So right now, Canada is in the midst of a wood boom, so to speak. Lumber prices have skyrocketed, and that is both due to demand and the issues at the border right now as a result of the pandemic. And I believe there's also talks of new tariffs. I saw some headlines, but that's a softwood lumber specific imports tariff situation. So what happens? I guess just to sort of move it along to speculate, what happens if we don't harvest old growth? Is our economy going to come grinding to a halt? Are hundreds of people going to lose jobs? It's hard to tell based on what you read in the media. So, from sort of a conservative estimate, what would be the negative impact of not harvesting this 1% that remains?
I love this question because I think we need to talk about this more and more. Okay, so let's say they stop logging old growth. Well, the first thing that's going to happen is that corporation's going to make less money because they're not getting the most valuable trees that they can. They're going to hate that because every corporation in a capitalist society needs to increase profit year after year. Does that necessarily mean that, entire towns will be laid off? No, because there is second growth that can be logged. We have to think about who the forest industry is working for. And from the year 2000 to 2015, 64,000 jobs were lost in the forest industry, 45,000 jobs were lost in the forest sector throughout BC, right? And they did an analysis and they found out that 64% of that was due to the logging companies themselves replacing people with automation and technology. And whereas like forest protection was 10%.
Wow.
So if we're to break down like why we're losing jobs, 10% is due to trying to protect ecosystems, whereas 64% is due to the companies themselves laying off people at any moment they can, because if they can replace that person with a piece of technology, they're going to make more profit at the end of it. So right now our forest industry is not working for communities. It's definitely not working for ecosystems. We're pushing species extinct. We're logging the last of our old growth. And it seems like the only thing they're working for is the corporations themselves. So I think we really have to reimagine how we want to operate in our forests. And what I would love to see is a push towards community managed and owned forests, where workers own the means of production, where workers own the company. They get a say in the company. They're employed locally. So all of a sudden, when the forest you're cutting is in your community, you're going to care more if you're logging in your watershed or you're logging in that last patch of old growth, and that's why I think place-based industries are going to benefit everyone in the long run, and the environment as well, because people don't want to do harm to the environment that is around them. That was a very long-winded answer.
But it's great. I am curious, though, as to what kind of response you get when you use the language "own the mean of production" or "return means of production" to the workers. Because traditionally, those who tend to lean to the right or exist south of our border hear the name Marx or anything related to it and go running.
Yeah.
Is this reimagining the industry in such a way that it would fulfill an ideology, or is it reimagining the industry in a way that would protect the environment and the industry?
Yeah, I think those are one of my solutions. It's not. I'm not saying that it has to be this way. I'm saying that's an option. We could also just have better rules for industries that want to operate here. So if you have a corporation that wants to operate here, we could operate where they have to prove that they won't do harm before they get the green light. Whereas like we play a very, very reactive game. We give them a green light and then we're like, oh my gosh, you cut down all the trees and species are going extinct and we have to clean up your mess. That's how we do it currently. So we could also just change it to where you have to prove you're capable of operating in a safe and healthy way, and then you can do that. So the thing I love about this is I just gave you two examples of how we can transform, right? And I feel like people really that's where they struggle with reimagining, and it's totally possible. We can totally do it. And it will benefit communities and it will benefit the environment as well. Communities won't be their fate won't be tied to an industry that is they're getting out of Dodge one way or the other. It just depends on how much force they take before they do. So all of a sudden we can have communities that control their fate more.
That makes a lot of sense. And it also means that when there are conflicts within, there are more likely to be amicable solution or sort of problem-solving mechanisms in place too, I would imagine, when you start looking community-based as opposed to industry-run.
Exactly.
Something you mentioned, and I'm going to share something and then see if it's familiar in forestry. I know in Alberta, there have been many, many issues with speculative oil drilling or small oil wells that companies have set up, and they've said to a landowner, for example, we're going to put this well here, we're going to pay you for it, and when we're done, we'll clean it up. And then when they're done, the company goes bankrupt intentionally and the well remains. And the government of Alberta has had to try and figure out solutions to that because you've got just average homeowners with an, a potentially dangerous environmental piece of infrastructure in their yard, pretty much. Is that what we're seeing in BC as well, where it's this kind of, yeah, we have rules, but there are so many ways around them, or there's such a lack of enforcement that it becomes problematic?
Yeah, it is. It's similar to BC's forestry industry for sure for some of the impacts that logging leaves, like the roads. They actually aren't required to clean up those roads and to restore those roads. So we have a legacy of forestry roads in BC that are literally altering predator-prey dynamics in ecosystems. That's how dense they are. And then we also have this little clause that is my nemesis in FERPA, so the Forest Range and Practice Act, that says you cannot unduly impact timber supply. So for instance, let's say BC had the strongest Species at Risk Act, and it protected all of the habitat. It protected all of the habitat on provincial land for a species at risk. FERPA, this clause, trumps every other law in BC. So yeah, you can protect as much habitat as you want up till the point where it unduly impacts timber supply. And that word unduly impacts timber supply is very, very vague and not really defined. So until we can get rid of that clause in FERPA, it's going to be very, very, very hard to protect biodiversity in the way we need to, because in some cases it would be illegal to do that because we'd be violating FERPA.
It sounds like language that has been in place for 300 years, frankly.
Yeah. It was built, like, this language was built for forestry to run the province. And that's why they have, is because this law was created to basically give the land to forest corporations in BC.
Let's talk about second growth. This is something that you've said, and it's another term that I think gets used, but a lot of us may not understand what it means. So we have old growth, which you've explained as growth of a certain type in a certain age, and we recognize its role in habitat is very significant. And I believe there are some endangered species linked to old growth as well. So I might get you to speak about that, but I also want to talk about what the second growth is and how that works, because again, this is what I know of forestry, despite our conversations, is grade school level. Wood is a renewable resource. You cut down one tree and you plant another, and then you can cut down another tree, ad nauseum.
Yeah.
But it's not quite that simple.
Yeah.
So how would you explain sort of that old growth versus new growth? And then we'll get into the ecosystem and wildlife.
So, well, we've been logging in, this province for hundreds of years now. And so all of that, like those old cut blocks and those places that they've been logging are starting to regrow to the age of about 40 and 100, right? So we have stands that have been cut a long, long time ago, and they're growing now to a point where they're about 40 to 100 years old. And that is what we call second growth. And in that range is a good time to log. It's, it's not getting into the old growth age. It's still big enough timber to be valuable. And, operating on this principle that everyone likes to think about is, well, we need wood, right? And, for the most part, That's true. Not at the rate we use it. And I think we should do more with it anyways. But yes, okay, if we need to log, we need to log second growth for sure. And we need to value add to that wood. So that means like when you log, you create local jobs, you employ local people, you ship it to people who will make that into wood for houses locally. All that stuff really adds value to the wood that you're logging. And all of a sudden you're employing more people from fewer trees. Anyways, so yeah, so second growth is forests that have previously been cut, well, 100 to 40 to 60 years ago, and they're regrown and ready to be logged again, versus primary forests, which are forests that have never been logged. So, yeah.
Okay. And those are the ones that we really need to protect.
Yes.
I understand that. And the role it plays in the ecosystem and wildlife, and I'm going to be a little intentionally naive here for the sake of the question, but does it matter to a squirrel, for example, if the tree is 200 years old or 50 years old? And how does this then impact endangered species? Sort of A, intentionally naive, B, follow through.
Cool. So a squirrel, you can see a squirrel like living on a fence post. A squirrel is what we would call like a generalist species. So they're sort of like the crows and the pigeons of the world, that, you know, are quick thinking, smart, adaptable, resourceful. They're able to find different niches and fill them within an ecosystem using what they have around them. Now that's not true for specialist species. Specialist species are ones that evolve very tightly with a certain ecosystem, and they have a sort of niche, like a sort of a role or a job that is very narrow. And they actually have evolved so tightly with other things in the ecosystem that taking away one of those supporting features would ultimately doom the species. So that's kind of what we've seen with spotted owls, which are probably Canada's most endangered species. There are 2 breeding pairs left in BC, and that is it in Canada. A single breeding pair, 2 owls, maybe 1 juvenile in BC, as far as we know. So they evolved in old growth forests. When I say evolved, like they literally adapted to live within this old, huge canopy that's spaced out. They have room to fly underneath and swoop in and hunt underneath. Their chicks, when they have babies, fly. They have to fly, I think it's over 10 kilometers away into another old growth site that has like rocky talus slopes nearby. That's also indicative of old growth. You'll have this spaced out rocky, forest floor within. And then the deciding factor on if they stay there is they'll call out, and if they hear another spotted owl nearby, then they'll stay. If they call out and they don't hear another spotted owl nearby, they'll keep going. And what's happened is that spotted owls are flying further and further, but without habitat. They do the call and there's no other owls around because it's all been logged, and then they keep flying, and they've literally found owls, like baby, like juvenile owls, that are dead from exhaustion from just like going and going and going, and they just can't find the habitat that they need. So
yeah, that's nuts.
Yeah, and it's sort of a similar story with caribou in the old growth and the high elevation. And so one of my biggest pet peeves is when I've talked to a government biologist before, and they've said, if only spotted owls weren't so like stupid. And I'm like, they actually evolved in a brilliant way. Like, who would have thought these huge old growth forests would be logged by these machines that are unimaginable, like, to a species? So they evolved in an amazing way. It's just we've destroyed ecosystems in a terrible way. So
yeah, and that is very much, I think, what Einstein meant when he said if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree.
Yeah.
Right? Like, interesting example, too, for listeners, is the Canada lynx. I know in the northern U.S., I believe maybe Montana or Idaho, they were talking about protecting the Canada lynx because of the impact of climate change. So that triangle of essential specialist behavior for them is their big paws that let them stand on the snow to hunt snowshoe hares. Very specific. And if you remove the hares or the snow, those big cats suddenly have a whole lot of problems.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why they're saying, well, with climate change, we have to be very aware because, there's less snow. That simple.
Yeah.
And now they can't hunt as efficiently, and the whole ecosystem gets thrown out of whack. So it's scary. But I guess then the populist follow-up to that, or the capitalist follow-up to that, is why don't we just let the birds die if there's only 2 left, as tragic as that may be, and make oodles of money on the forest? You're making a lot of faces as I say this. Oh my God. For listeners.
I didn't even know I was. I can't even control my face anymore. Oh man, I gotta get better at that. Seriously.
To be fair, I was needling a little bit there. I was needling.
Oh no, I lost track of what you said. Oh yeah, why don't we let species go extinct? I think there's like multiple ways you could answer this. There's like the inherent right to like save species that you've doomed. It's like we're the reason they're at risk.
Yep.
There should be no other reason but because it's our responsibility, because we did this to them, we should do everything we can to save them. But this is also like, what do we want as a future? Like if we can't save species now, I feel like it will be a very bad precedent set that like, oh, well, if a species is going extinct, we must let them because like, that's just the way it has to be. Right now we have, a few species up for extinction in Canada. It's going to get crazy soon. It's going to be hundreds, thousands, and into the millions. And so we might say, well, why not just let this one go extinct now? But if we set that precedent, that means millions of species will go extinct because it means that we're not going to try to save them. And so, when you rationalize, well, it's just one species going extinct, can you then rationalize a million? I don't think so. So we have to treat every species like we need to save them.
And the clear follow-up is, isn't there endangered species legislation that would protect them from this logging activity, Charlotte?
Oh my goodness. Oh, I love this question. Okay, so Canada has a Species at Risk Act. If you were to read the act, you'd be like, hey, this isn't so bad. But when it gets applied, governments have found very, very huge gaping loopholes in the law. The federal government gives responsibility to the provinces and territories to protect the species on their land, so non-federal land. So, the federal government would look at BC and say, okay, BC, that old growth forest has a dozen species at risk in it, but that's on provincial land. So you're up. We're going to give you the first chance of protecting them there. And if your laws fail to effectively protect those species, then we're going to have to step in. BC has no law to protect species at risk, so we fail every time. We are terrible. We have the most species at risk in Canada out of every province and territory. And when we fail, the federal government should be there to enforce protection like the Species at Risk law was written, but they are very, very, very reluctant to do so, and they've only ever done it twice. So what ends up happening is that Canada and BC have been in this like synchronized combative dance since 2003 where they dodge responsibility from the law and throw it back onto the other person. And then what ends up happening is nothing gets done and species die. And that's where we're at.
Yeah. And of note, I believe it was in the 2017 election following that, political or NDP leader and Premier John Horgan had establishing species at risk legislation as a mandate. And following his second election in the middle of a pandemic, that seems to have disappeared. Yeah. And I will not offer commentary on that. I am just sharing the facts. So I guess then the next question becomes, what are we supposed to do? I mean, I think that's you in just the span of a casual conversation made multiple suggestions of how we could subtly or significantly shift this industry, of what legislation can be used. Like all of the tools are available, but there seems to be a lack of political will. So, what are the next steps for individuals, organizations, and so on to try and protect old growth and to try and get legislative solutions to be
Mhm.
used?
I think part of the reason that nothing has worked in BC on the environmental front for pressuring John Horgan is because he just feels so secure in his uh, position without the environmental vote. Like he's like, I think
Hmm.
he thinks that he doesn't need us. He can like totally blow it on the environment, but do other social things that are great, and so he'll get by anyways. And I hate the fact that that is kind of true. And so yeah, so I think we really need to just show up in higher numbers and scare him. At the end of the day, what this government wants is re-election. And if we can get majority of BC people up in arms honestly about this, they will have no choice but to listen. It's always when the majority is on board when they're going to start to really take these things seriously. And so I think what's happening in the BC forest right now and bringing the fight to media around the world, it's like an international story now, is just showing how dire it is and what people are willing to do to save these forests. And I mean, John Horgan can try to remain silent he has so far, but he's not going to get away with that for much longer. The more people that become involved and speak up for old growth and species at risk, the better. And bringing it to your MLAs, your elected officials, bring it to them, say that you want old growth logging stopped. These are all things that at the end of the day, I think is going to be the tipping point of whether he listens to the people who elected him or the corporations. So that's where I think we're at. Yeah.
Yeah, getting active. And Wilderness Committee has some great simple actions to take and recommendations on that. And there are other groups across British Columbia and frankly Canada working on this too. So while you and I have a fun time chatting about it, people can look for many places to get this.
Absolutely. I
Um,
do just want to mention we have a tool on our website. It's the Old Growth Escalator, and it's an action tool. And basically, it starts you on the path of becoming an old growth protector. So the first step will be a
awesome.
simple thing like an action tool. The second step might be a phone call. The third step might be to meet with your MLA, and then so on and so forth. As long as you're involved, like interested in getting to the next step, we will take your hand and boom, move you up that ladder. So.
And I was just going to say the meet with your MLA for old growth, request a meeting, call that. Like I'm looking at these buttons on the site right
Mhm.
now, and I can click right now, and it pops up with, what information to use. It's got the talking points, and then it's a one-click letter. Same thing for the call now and request a meeting. I'm familiar with the tool you're using, and they're really easy to use
Mhm.
tools
Yeah.
on both sides. So that's I think really important as well. Some social media stuff. The other two quick things I wanted to touch on. One, I don't think it's been too much of an issue, but is there anything in media reporting of this that people need to be wary of? In terms of wildlife reporting, we're often talking about sensationalism and specific language that's used by the media.
Mhm.
But in this, there's a little more politics and a little less guesswork, I think.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to see if there is something
Uh,
that's happening in the media we need to be
You
aware
know,
of.
the only thing I like, okay, so I feel like there's a bunch of blockades happening now on Vancouver Island to stop old growth logging.
Mhm.
The media reporting there took a long time to get there and to report on the story, but once they did, it's been decent.
Okay.
They're not really telling the story of species at risk yet, though. But I'm hoping to push them in that direction and to talk, not push them in that direction, but to also share that side of the story.
Yeah.
But I will say, like, I've had experiences with trying to protect species at risk in the past and having mainstream news organizations um, literally only telling the one side of the story. This really happened with caribou when a partnership
Yes.
agreement that was Indigenous led was on the table. Um, I would say 95% of the reporting was this is going to be a job killer. This is awful. Like, we can't do this. And I would, I would, every single time I would see one of these articles, I'd send the reporter, hey, by the way, this is what I see wrong with this article. Can you please show this side of the story? Nothing.
Yeah.
And that I can't tell you how frustrating it is to see something and know that there's this huge other side of the story that they're just not sharing. And it's so frustrating because so many people still rely on those mainstream organizations. They don't go digging a little bit deeper. And that creates a rhetoric for people who want to be educated on the topic, but don't know where else to find the other opinions. So
yeah, that can be tricky. And that's there was one case where the headline, and this is adjacent but similar, the headline was coyotes attack dog. I think the second or third sentence of the story was that the dog ran away from its owner and chased the coyotes. So I said, I wrote a letter to the reporter and the editor, and I said, look, your article describes this as a dog attacking coyotes, and your headline calls it a coyote attack. Can you please update that? And I got back out, well, if you'd like to contribute a letter to the editor, we'll consider publishing it. And as a former journalist, I know it's not pleasant to get those letters and phone calls, but... big but. There's very clearly sometimes a problem, and I think it behooves people to keep calling it out as you do when it happens.
Yeah, it's a small thing, but it's huge, right? It shapes people's. Now a lot of people are just headline readers, so they're going to read that and be like, oh my gosh, coyotes, this is awful. We have to be careful.
Yeah. And I think particularly with the blockades, and I don't want to get into it because I simply do not have a deep enough understanding of it. And there's a lot of other social and colonialist things that need to be considered in those conversations. But yeah, if you're not sitting down and reading those articles, you're not getting the story from the headlines at this point. They're very involved and convoluted at times. Who said what, who's doing what, which side from what, and so on. So at the very least, read more, not less, should be, I think, our message outward. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the mapping tool. I believe we've talked about this before, but I thought we'd give it another summary before we wrap up, because it's a very interesting and important tool that's out there.
That would be awesome. Okay. Thank you for bringing this up, because I was going to forget about talking about it. But this is one of the things I'm the most proud of in my work here at Wilderness Committee, but it's essentially an online mapping tool that anyone from the public can use. What you're going to find on this tool, it sort of is a story, and you go down and you scroll, and eventually you'll hit maps. Now, the first map is a map of all of BC, and it will show you all newly proposed industry operations within federally listed and protected species at risk habitat. So let's say you're really concerned about marbled murrelet, and you live on the island, and you want to say, you know what, I'm worried. I see logging trucks. I want to make sure they're not logging marbled murrelet habitat. You scroll into where you are, and you'll be able to see every cup block proposed in their habitat. Now it maps cup blocks, and then it maps oil and gas facilities and associated activities. And so, and this isn't a historical map. It doesn't show historical logging. It just shows stuff that are new. So you still have a chance to stop it. And a lot of these projects, when they're at the very, very, very beginning planning phase, if you can get out ahead of them, you have a way more higher chance, wow, Charlotte. You have a much higher chance of stopping those projects. So a tool like this is actually how we found and stopped the Argonaut Creek cut blocks in caribou habitat. So I wanted to give that to everyone in BC to use if they're worried about a species at risk.
I want to thank Charlotte for her time and remind you to check out some of the tools the Wilderness Committee has developed to help you speak out for old-growth trees like the amazing Lorax you are. Just visit wildernesscommittee.org to get started, or check them out on social media for more. It's been a while since we released an episode, so I'm going to remind you to go back and listen to my curse-laden episode 10 of this season if you didn't catch why there's been a break. I also want to remind you we'll be releasing episodes every other week now, with occasional uploads for special features or items I find amusingly essential to share. You can follow me on Instagram at HowieMichael, or like Defender Radio on Facebook for more updates about the show and to get in touch with me about any questions, ideas, or comments you may have. Thank you all, and until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bearers, reminding you to be kind and to stay informed and stay strong.